So, welcome back, everyone.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, I presume you were all here in the earlier session where we discussed this new interactive session mode we are in. So, as I said, we had the practice run in session 5. Now you're all well rehearsed in this, and I expect all of you to be even more interactive. Feel free, this is a very cozy environment, so feel free to raise your hands, stand on the chairs if you want, whatever, to get this even more interactive as we move forward. I'm going to actually, at the end, because I said earlier, we needed to actually conclude this session with some also conclusions and recommendations, inputs for states and for ICAO to help states in implementation of the TRIP strategy. So I really count on you. We have for this session 6, 3 distinguished panelists. Unfortunately, we're not doing very well on gender balance in this session. We're doing slightly better in the earlier session, but which means that I would expect more women from the audience to participate even more fully to make up for the gender imbalance we have up here. So please join me in welcoming Simon Daignan, who is Program Manager, Travel Documentation and Security at the OSCE. Luvuyo Geke, who is Executive Aviation Security of the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa. And Eric Slavenas, Identity Management and Biometrics Officer at the International Organization for Migration. So just like we did earlier, these 3 gentlemen had shared their presentation, which was put on the website of TRIP for you to read through before we launch the discussions and questions. I guess you heard the drill early on, so I'm sure you were busy reading those presentations during the coffee break, which means we can go straight into the discussions, right? Yes. Yes? No? Would you rather we have a short summary, the 4 or 5 minutes summary of each of the presentations before we get into discussions? Yes? No? You there? We're all here? Okay, interactive means you have really to interact with me. So let's really do this. It's the last session of the day, so let's make a good run of it and make the most of it. So I'm going to ask Simon first to do basically a 4-5 minute time. Very diligent timekeeper here will throw the laptop at you if you exceed the 4 minutes. I said 5. She was saying no, 4. So 4 minutes. Let's go.
Before you start the timer, let me ask a question of the audience. Who here has heard of Game of Thrones? Yes, good. I see some hands. Well, for those of you who don't know, it was the last season of Game of Thrones this year. And in the last episode, well, hang on, this is a spoiler alert, by the way, for anyone who's planning on watching it. But in the last episode of Game of Thrones, Westeros, which is the country, I guess, that they live in, gets destroyed. Oh. But it gets destroyed by a suspicious traveler. A suspicious traveler who uses broken travel to get to Westeros. And who has been planning, this is a pre-planned attack, so they have bad intentions from the beginning. Her name was Daenerys Targaryen. Now, she wasn't on a plane, she was on a fire-breathing dragon, but that doesn't matter so much. If the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms knew in advance of this traveler and her bad intentions, maybe they could have stopped her. There was someone who knew of this person's plans and her travel plans. It was Bran Stark. If Westeros had an API system, they could have been saved. Bran Stark could have passed this information to Westeros, and Game of Thrones would have had a different ending. Right, time to get serious. You can start my timer. I work for the OSCE. We've been working on API and PNR issues since 2016. I've been helping now 13 different countries to establish these type of systems. So we've come up with a number of different good practices that states can follow for establishing these systems. And in order to make it easy to remember, this is my ABC guide to API. ABC. So let's start with A. Who here thinks they know what A stands for? Clue? Celine spoke about it earlier. Come on, give me some shouts. No, not advanced. Airlines. Airlines. Okay? Good practice number 1 is airlines. Treat them like partners. They are the ones with the data. Chances are they are already transmitting API and or PNR data to other countries. They can tell you what is possible and what's not possible. Now, how can you treat them like partners? Well, in 3 ways. Firstly, Celine touched upon it earlier as well, set up a stakeholder consultation group to notify them that you plan to collect passenger data and to also keep them updated of your plans. Secondly, you will need a technical implementation guide, which is basically a user manual outlining the legal, operational, technical things that the airlines will need for implementing API. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Finland has theirs online, so just Google technical implementation guide, replace the word Finland with the name of your country, and you're about 80% of the way there. And the third way is stay flexible. There will be problems dealing with the airlines, there will be connectivity issues. Don't go for sanctions from the beginning. Okay, so that's A. What is B? Any guesses? Chris also touched upon it. This stands for binding legislation. Binding legislation. Now, I just spoke about the need for partnership with the airlines, but you will also need binding legislation that obliges them to send you the data. Why? Well, it costs them money to actually send it to you, and also they need to comply with other data privacy regimes in their home country. Now, your legislation should basically say the what, the why, the when, the how of API. What data should be sent to you? Why do you want it? What's the purpose of you collecting this data? Who the airline should send the data to, and who will be using the data? When you want them to send the data, and also for how long you plan to use it or to keep it. So that's B, binding legislation. C, who wants to guess what C is for? Collaboration. Carleen, you already have my presentation. C stands for collaboration. Building a passenger data system can be great. It can really help collaboration, and if already many agencies in your country are working together, collaborating, cooperating, brilliant. But I've been to countries where this is not the case. In fact, I was in one recently where borders wanted an API system, but also customs wanted an API system. They weren't speaking to each other, and both borders and customs developed their own separate API systems. A lot of time, a lot of money wasted. The politicians went crazy. So collaboration is better than competition between the agencies. So in summary, say them back to me now. A is for airlines, good. B is for binding legislation, and C is for collaboration. Excellent. Happy to take any questions that you might have, except from the guy who asked me about, well, it was a crazy question yesterday, about Bitcoin or something along those lines. Please, no questions about Bitcoin. I know nothing about it. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Maybe one quick question. You mentioned this API and PNR issue. We had a discussion on that earlier in the earlier session. when it comes to the binding nature, whether the legal provisions, would you recommend a single legislation which covers both the API and PNR requirements, or would you recommend separate legislation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And many countries are having difficulties with that because, of course, they are both bits of passenger data. But what's important to understand, and what I've seen in countries who are drafting their legislation, is that there is different timing issues for when this data can be sent. They also come from different systems in the airlines. It's also different data elements. They're often collected for different purposes, let's say. API maybe is more for border control, immigration, while PNR is more for law enforcement, counterterrorism. That means that it may also have different users. And in addition, at least if you look at European legislation, it has different retention periods as well. So at least good practices that I've seen is that not necessarily two different laws, but certainly two maybe different regulations within the same law, or certainly different elements dealing with API and PNR, because there are many differences between the two. So I would try to differentiate it in their legislation.
Thank you. Eric.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Regarding the question about API and PNR legislation, obviously there is no universal model, prescriptive, that would tell you how to do. No two countries are alike, and normally you would see what works there better. I suppose the underlying question is, what are the needs of that country at the moment? Whether they're going to go for API or PNR. Typically, most countries that implemented API, they would share advice that if you have no experience with passenger data, go with API, because it requires quite a bit of practice. So if this is the case, then there is no point probably to develop too much legislation on PNR, but rather focus on what the current priorities are.
Okay. And Riovo, in terms of the South African experience on this legislation for PNR and API, you've gone the interactive API route, but in terms of the legislation, have you covered both in one?
I subscribe to the school that Eric just spoke to, where you eat the elephant one stick at a time. So you first do the easy one, and then you legislate for that, and then once you've implemented, and then you go to the next one and you legislate for that as well. As Simon said, it can be in the same legislation, but different sections.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe, Eric, could you make your 4-minute presentation now? The beauty about interactive session, we can actually, there's no scripted format. That's why we are changing things as we go along. It's funnier that way.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 4 minutes be it. I'll try to be very punctual. First of all, big thanks to the ICAO Secretariat for inviting IOM to this important event. And it is a special pleasure to be on the innovative API panel, which is one of the hottest items on our agenda and is much debated in border management technical assistance. I wanted to share with you a few insights that IOM has generated through providing technical assistance to member states in implementing API and PNR. During the last couple of years, need for technical assistance in passenger data has ballooned considerably, and I think there are 3 good reasons for that. First of all, the political momentum, the UN Security Council resolutions that urge member states to increasingly use passenger data, both API and PNR. Secondly, it is the ICAO regulatory framework, the standard that requires legacy API to be implemented by all member states, and other standards and recommended practices. And the third reason, I think, is just being pragmatic. Quite a few governments and border agencies realize that in order to manage your border controls well, your border controls have to be risk-based and intelligence-driven and technology-empowered. And passenger data is very much central to those efforts of raising both border security and facilitation. At IOM, the International Organization for Migration, during those couple of years, we had probably a bit more than API, PNR assistance projects in probably a bit more than a dozen of countries, primarily in Europe and Central Asia and Caucasus. Starting from this year, we started API, PNR, technical assistance, workshops, assessments in some African countries. And we have been talking with quite a few member states of the African Union. And we are very proud of it because IOM is an organization with physical presence in 150 states, and we try to divert this kind of technical assistance where the needs are. Just to give you, finally, a very quick overview what that looks in practice when I say technical assistance for API implementation, PNR implementation. Each country is different, and in a way, each has unique needs. However, there are 5 or 6, perhaps 7 main building blocks that a typical API, PNR, technical assistance project would consist of. The first one is technical consultations, advocacy workshops, so that government officials would understand the foundations of what passenger data is all about and what is the regulatory framework. In addition to that, we do technical assessments required for API and or PNR implementation. We also do legal assessments and help member states to develop their passenger data legislation. This is closely related to the protection of privacy and data, but not only. And solid legislation is a very, very, very important element of success. Another area is stakeholder management, and in some states, we have been working with national governments in setting up an API or PNR working group and facilitating the debate in order to reach a consensus what that country needs as far as API, PNR is concerned, and how to implement the final system compliant with international standards at a reasonably good value. Which brings us to another component, managing the tender. Most countries would have a procurement tender to buy the services for API, for passenger data, and often also buy additional hardware and software. Some states are comfortable with managing it themselves. Some would rely on external technical assistance. And the final area, which sometimes gets forgotten, but I think it is very important, is building the capacity of analytics, how to exploit the passenger data. API and PNR as raw data is relatively useless. It's just names and figures and the rest of it, unless it is analyzed and turned into some tactical intelligence that can be used for risk assessments, or if it is used against some knowledge that already exists, such as watch lists, alert lists, and similar. In my presentation, in my readable presentation, which is online, I listed quite a few of challenges and lessons learned. I will not get into that, but if you would like to discuss any of them in a greater detail, I would be delighted to. The final slide of my presentation lists a number of names and email addresses of my regional colleagues around the world who are responsible for coordinating new API PNR technical assistance initiatives. So if your country, if your government agency is considering the need for technical assistance, feel free to get in touch with my colleagues, with the nearest one to your country, and discuss your technical assistance needs. The more we know what your needs are, the better we will be able to mobilize technical expertise and donor funding support and provide assistance that would be useful in practical terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Luvuyo, can you please share with us your thoughts?
Thank you, Vijay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to start off with an interesting introduction, but unfortunately, I don't watch much TV, so I don't know a lot about Games of Thrones. But maybe...
That was interesting, too.
For me, maybe let me start off with a disclaimer. When I got this assignment to come and speak here, I'll call it an assignment, my first reaction was to say a big no. The reason being, I don't regard myself, I am not an API expert, I am not a trip expert, I am not a facilitation expert.
Join the club.
Yeah.
Everybody here is not an expert in this.
But like all good, I'm an aviation security practitioner, not even an expert at that. But like all good security people, we comply and complain later. So I'll complain when I get back home. But maybe that is actually the problem. The fact that we've always looked at facilitation and security as being maybe counterbalancing each other, rather than looking at them as complementary of each other. Actually, if you look at the trip programs, to me, they are more security than they are anything else. So maybe that's why how we need to start looking at them as programs that assist us in implementing effective security. And what is also I find good about them is that there's another line that is becoming blurred, the line between aviation security and national security. Now, the beauty with these programs, they cross the line, they create that bridge, because they don't only look at aviation security, but they look at security in totality. So those are some of the benefits of implementing the programs. They allow us to conduct risk assessment, that they allow us to extend our borders, because you're able to stop the offender, would-be offender, before they've even left their home state. Therefore, you don't need to stop them when they get to you. And they allow us to share information with other states, risk information with other states. So these are some of the benefits that we believe are there in the implementation of these programs. But in terms of implementation, for me, the one big word which has come through already is collaboration, working together. And that's the only way to implement. If you take from our experience, for example, our Department of Home Affairs, which is the department responsible for immigration, is the one that is responsible for API. They receive the API information. But working together, we wouldn't be working alone, rather, they wouldn't be able to extract maximum benefit. So then that's why it's important that the information that is received is shared with state security, is shared with the police, and therefore we are able now, because not one department can have all the necessary skills and the necessary competences. So that information is able to be shared and looked at using different eyes. Secondly, talking collaboration, there's also collaboration between, as has been emphasized already, between the government and the airlines, because that's the only way to get the information. There needs to be that partnership, which starts at implementation, which starts pre-implementation with all those workshops and working together, has already been highlighted. And thirdly, there is the collaboration between man and machine. So it's not man versus machine, but it's man with the machine. Even though we are on interactive API, where the system has got, is able to do its own checks and validation, but we've got a 24-hour call center where all the hits that are picked up can be validated by a human being with the assistance of the machine, which does the preliminary work, and therefore that also assists. And also, lastly, I'll mention continuous engagement, which is what we do. We've got weekly and monthly checks where we look at the system, and therefore that information is shared back with the airlines. Emails are sent back, whether it's asking for more information or sharing whatever the experience has been. So that's why I'm saying, for me, the most important thing is cooperation, collaboration, and working together so that we can extract the most out of these programs. Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you very much, Yuvo. Please, ladies and gentlemen, don't forget the email to send in your questions, and raise your hands if you also want to put your question live. One question which came through was to the panel whether you think that API PNR can help render visa procedures redundant. I mean, is there hope that with a system of PNR API, the need for visas would actually be less onerous? Yuvo.
I was hoping that Simon, since he's going to leave early, he could take the first question. But yeah, it will depend. I wouldn't say it would make them redundant, but it could make them easier, and it would make it easier to process. Because then you would have to look at what was the objective of the visa in the first place, what information were we trying to draw. And secondly, with the visa application, how long did it take? That is the processing and looking at all the information, whereas with API, depending on where the flight is coming from, you've got very limited time, which would have had in the visa application. But so it will vary from case to case. Some cases it could take them away. Some cases you would still need to, depending on what information was required for the visa processing, I would say.
Thank you. One other question was in terms of, you mentioned, Eric, the idea of technical assistance. And I think Simon also, ICAO also provides some technical assistance when it comes to implementation of API. And so the question is what sort of coordination exists between IOM, OSCE, ICAO, when it comes to that technical assistance towards the states? Can you help us? And I asked somebody from ICAO also to step in there when it comes to the ICAO part, but maybe Simon from the OSCE, if you can just briefly tell us what is that technical assistance you're able to provide to states, and then what, if any, coordination happens with...
Sure, and you've named ICAO, IOM,
and maybe others.
OSCE, yeah. There's multiple others as well. We've heard about the UN CT travel program, also ICMPD, there's also Interpol, Frontex. There's many organizations out there that are offering support to states. The United States also has a program and software which they give to states for free. At least how the OSCE works, we try and be as open and transparent as possible when we're going to a country to arrange, let's say, a national workshop or to help them draft a national action plan. We involve as many of our partners as possible, especially partners who are active in the region, likes of IOM, Frontex, Interpol. We always bring along ICAO as well and invite IATA, of course, and together we come up with an action plan for helping states to establish an API or PNR system. Then, of course, the country, perhaps some countries may have a better presence with IOM on the ground. For example, we in one or two countries in the Caucasus, let's say, where the OSCE doesn't have a field presence, the IOM has taken over in terms of implementing the roadmap that the OSCE drafted. And we have very good cooperation on the ground there, and likewise we're following that model in other countries. In other, let's say, Central Asian countries where we both have field presence, we're doing everything jointly. So we try to ensure that there's not competition between the different organizations and that we are all working towards the same goal, which is ultimately to ensure that everybody has an API or PNR system. So it's not always perfect. Sometimes countries can ask 6 different agencies for the exact same support, and then it's up to us to try and make sure that we're not competing with one another, but really are delivering coordinated support. So yeah, we try our best. We do realise that there are a lot of offers for support out there, and we try and make sure that we're not duplicating one another's efforts.
Thank you, Simon. Eric?
Hopefully Eric won't say the opposite.
You've coordinated the responses. Yeah.
Thank you. I think these are very good points, and obviously in providing passenger data technical cooperation between providers is essential. The resources and technical expertise on passenger data are limited, and the last thing one would like is to waste time and energy and resources. So we do coordinate, and probably there are almost 10 major actors involved in this area. Now, when a state approaches an international organization, there is no international protocol how to do it. Some countries, if they want to implement API or PNR or both, would just do it themselves because they have capacity and they are confident in it. Some would approach an international organization such as IOM or a regional organization such as OSCE for typically a donor-funded technical assistance. In yet another scenario, a country may just hire private consultancy if they can pay the bills. So normally the request for technical assistance in API and PNR comes to an agency that often has a good working dialogue, in the field with the capital. And in IOM's case, when we receive such assistance and develop technical assistance programming, we would try to coordinate it and engage our partners to see how we could join forces to make most of it. And indeed, some joint events that IOM and OSCE did in the Caucasus and Central Asia, I think we're shining examples of doing it together and doing it well.
Okay. Thank you very much. ICAO? Christopher. First row.
Thank you, Vijay. So just briefly, we wanted to note that on API capacity building assistance workshops, we, as ICAO, have participated and partnered with a number of organizations on their platform or on our platform. And to name a few, IOM, OSCE, UNODC, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the ASEAN Regional Forum, IATA, and UN counterterrorism structures. And at the same time, we're also developing more in-depth, let's say a week-long training material or a course which we can provide both, let's say, for API PNR as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. If I can actually throw that question back to the participants, you've heard it in terms of a coordinated technical assistance being available to states in terms of a more effective implementation of API and PNR, in terms of perhaps better processes for tendering, for implementing. What has been your experience? If any one of you from the states could share with us either positive or negative experiences in benefiting from the technical assistance being available from quite a number of institutions. I think that would be helpful if you were willing and able to share that in the confidence of this room. Anybody wants to share an experience of having taken up the opportunity of a technical assistance being provided by an institution, used it, and felt that experience was very positive, or learned a few things from that experience? Anybody wants to share an experience?
Too shy.
Or was it? How many of you actually have used technical assistance? Do you vote? Did you use technical assistance when you implemented IAPI in South Africa 10 years ago? It was before your time. So they must have used technical assistance. It was before your time. When you arrived, they didn't need it. Anybody wants to share something? How many of you have actually used technical assistance? Hello? Anybody use technical assistance in terms of API, PNR? Nobody? Interesting. Nobody here has actually used technical assistance in implementing API or PNR.
Well, the people who are receiving the assistance may not be sitting in this room.
Yeah, they're busy seeking the assistance somewhere else, I guess. Okay. Victoria Reader, are you in the room or you live stream? So Victoria, could you, because you put a question, I thought since we don't have the other gender on this panel, I wanted to give you a voice. Tell us your question. Yeah, you're on.
My question pertains to the fact that Luvulio is the only aviation security person that we've heard from in this event, as far as I can tell. The question is whether aviation security agencies are able to take advantage of the knowledge that is generated by API results. Can a person who is identified as a threat be denied boarding? Can a person who is unknown be subjected to additional screening? Can a legitimate traveler be expedited through the checkpoint? This is separate, yet intersecting with the processes by the border agencies. A corollary question is there a forum that can bring together the border agencies, the aviation security agencies, and the facilitation agencies to ponder that question? Does such a forum exist, and if so, what is it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So two questions. Let's take the first one, maybe Yuvo, in terms of how you can better handle, I suppose, the sorting of passengers in terms of the level of threat.
Aviation security agencies should and could be using the information more to give direction to whether it's screeners on the ground or it's operatives who are at the airport level. How we are currently processing it is the state security which looks at the information. But should there be a need, then they could share that information. Having said that, I believe we could do more in terms of having those measures that now that this passenger has been identified, what do we do additionally? And how we've previously done coordination, you find that sometimes you've got better coordination higher up at national level, where you find that maybe the coordination on the ground is not as good or effective as it can be, which is something that we've changed recently in that if you take we started with our biggest airport, where we daily now, where all the law enforcement agencies at the airport have a forum where they meet daily to look at issues happening, to look at information that has been received. And then there's also a weekly meeting to look at that. That forum came out of necessity with some of the challenges we were having. So to address those, that forum was created, but it's proving very effective. We are now rolling it out to other airports as well, where we're starting to say, have this forum that's not meeting once a month or once quarterly, that's sitting daily and looking at what's happening at the airport, that one information is there. So what you're saying is that information also, because you find that these three agencies who've got access to the API information, they are part of that forum, and that information could be used more effectively there. And as we progress and go to PNR, which I believe will give us more information, then we're able to use it more effectively.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, great question, Victoria. And you're asking, can passengers be denied boarding using API? Can they be sent for secondary screening? Can it be used for facilitating passengers? Yes, absolutely. That's one of the main purposes of it. That, as Eric said, on its own, this is just data unless it's actually properly used. I mean, as an example, the UK has an interactive API system. They deny people boarding every single day. I think that it could be used even more for passenger facilitation. I think that as more and more countries start using API, I think that it will be used more for passenger facilitation. You asked whether there is a forum for comparing, let's say, how states can use this information for targeting, for profiling, things like that. I know that the EU gathers experts from their passenger information units, and they compare notes, let's say, on how they do profiling using PNR data and also API data. But I think it's I'm not aware of anywhere else that they do it globally, but I think it's a good point and something actually that the OSC might look at doing for its 57 states. So thanks for that. And I need to shoot off now because I have a flight at 6:30, but thank you all very much, and I'll hand back to Vijay.
Eric. Thank you. But before you go, Simon, let me just quickly ask this question, because you made the point that it is good practice that airlines be treated as partners. And Eric, you made the point also that a good working relationship with carriers is vital. Liovo, in your presentation, you talk, and I quote, failure to adhere by airlines attract penalties. How do you reconcile this approach, the partnership, the penalties?
Yes, very quickly.
Yes. You can talk as you walk through.
If you don't,
that's all right.
If you don't have penalties, it's very
difficult.
difficult to enforce legislation. So you need to have penalties in place to act as a carrot to ensure that enforcement is ensured. As an example, we have Simon Watkins here from the UK, so maybe I'll throw the floor to you also. But the UK have been gathering passenger data now for 15 years or so, and they have a number of different sanctions in place that they can use for airlines. They're collecting API, PNR, and IAPI. How many times in that entire period do you think they've actually fined an airline? Zero. They use the threat of fines to ensure that the airlines comply. So that's usually sufficient. You don't need to start throwing the fines out straight away. Treat them like partners. Just use the threat of fines to make sure they comply.
Liovo, you threaten or you actually fine airlines?
Right.
It's more threatening.
Very much.
As I mentioned earlier, the first step is to send back an email to say, please give us more information. So it's the stick you're holding at the back that I've got this, but let's work together and let's partner.
Okay. Eric?
Yes, thank you, Vijay. That's a very important topic, and it keeps popping up in our lessons in many countries in the world. And many of the lesson is that a good working relationship with carriers cannot be taken for granted. It requires effort and time and a little bit of expense in order to make it work. I think it is unrealistic to expect that just a big stick will guarantee good cooperation. Just legislation, just obligations is not enough. And normally, the implementation worked really well where government agencies allocated designated focal points for dealing with airlines and structured regular working meetings and communication channels and all that. It really requires effort, but it pays off with success. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe as a follow-up question to that, since the panel seemed to agree, and maybe you also agree, that this need to develop a partnership with the airlines is critical, given the role airlines play in transmitting the data. If you look at Annex 9.12, which talk about contracting states should refrain from imposing fines and penalties on aircraft operators for any errors caused by a systems failure, which may have resulted in the transmission of no or corrupted data to the public authorities in accordance with API systems. I mean, that seems to be a kind of a logical step from what you're saying, the need to partner with airlines. So my question to you, and especially to ICAO, why is 9.12 not a standard? It's a recommended practice on states refraining to impose fines and penalties on aircraft operators for a failure due to a systems failure. Why is that a recommended practice and not a standard?
I think Vijay will have a comment from...
Yes, please. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. There are quite a few standards in Annex 9 that tell states not to impose fines in certain circumstances. It is actually, in my opinion, a bit humbling that these standards are necessary, or these recommended practices. Because if we look at the cooperation that airlines have, airlines do not mean to restrict us states from having that information. They want to give the information to comply with regulations of a government. It's often governments with differences in regulations, systems, timings, etc., that make it difficult for airlines to comply with the regulations. We as states are not able to have a limited set of standards and saying, this is all you can ask for API, for example, you shall not ask more, never do that. No, states go all over the place with different timings, different elements, etc. So the errors is the same fact that if states ask differences or don't have the systems in place for airlines to comply with that, then you will have errors if it is, or you have a lack of information. The fact that in Annex 9 we have about 4 standards not to give fines in certain circumstances is to protect our airlines, because governments are not always realistic in their expectations. Whether it should be a standard, I would be fine with that. Then of course you would have to say what is an explanation of an error of the system, etc. But still, the fact that we as states are very hesitant to, that we should be very hesitant to apply fines, I think that should be something that all states should really integrate in their whole system. Be very careful with fines, because it is not the way to enforce airlines to comply. They want to comply. We have to make it easy for them to be able to apply the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to comment on this issue of fines being a recommended practice? Yes, Eric.
Thank you. If I may add, this recommended practice is actually a good reminder that there may be legitimate situations where errors in API PNR is not the responsibility of the carrier. A good example, I suppose, is multiple citizens, people who have two passports. And if you check in using your one passport and then forget and give your second passport to the immigration, then API technically would be incorrect. However, it has nothing to do with the carrier. So I suppose this recommended practice, even if it is not an obligatory standard, it is a reminder that any sanctions in this respect should be used reasonably.
Thank you, Eric. Any other comments, questions? Any experience you'd like to share in terms of either the challenges you've had in terms of implementing API in your state, or good experiences you've had in implementing API in your state? Anyone wants to share? Please, our friend from Botswana.
Thank you. In response to earlier question about how would aviation security facilitate traveler through the use of API, I think when we look at the resolution 2396 to prevent the movement of terrorists, what would happen is that at the time when this passenger buys a ticket, through transmission of API, there will be that vetting. After the vetting, there will be a decision whether to issue a ticket. So if the state agency has decided that this person is a threat, then they will be denied a ticket, which means they won't be able to travel. Thank you.
Thank you. You actually raise an interesting question in terms of timing. Interactive API is supposed to be a live interaction at the point of check-in as to whether the person would be allowed to check in for a flight. And as Celine explained earlier, it's supposed also to connect with online check-in once the processes are there. The question which you raise is actually a very interesting one, is what happens at the earlier point when a passenger is buying a ticket, expecting to travel, but not knowing that down the road, at the moment of check-in, he or she will be denied travel, which means a ticket having been bought for nothing, which could be or not be refunded. So is there a way where that process of allowing a person to know whether he or she should actually buy the ticket, if it's going to be denied travel down the road, what's the point of actually spending money buying a ticket? That's actually a good point being made. What are your thoughts on this, Eric and Luvuyo? Is it conceivable that the system could be pushed as we progress to actually make it even more user-friendly in terms of facilitation for the passenger to know, I mean, why do I buy a ticket if I'm going to be denied travel?
Not being a technical expert, but I would say it could, because if you able to put, rather than pushing the information as a batch, you push the information as it comes through. Therefore, decisions could be taken earlier. However, what we have now is better than what we had previously, because that passenger would have been denied entry at the arrival station, and the airline would have had to carry them back at cost. So rather be denied at boarding, but I think it could be enhanced further to be done as the information comes through.
Good point. The best can always get better. Eric.
No, I have no major additions, I'm afraid, but I wouldn't think too far into the future, about grand changes and revolutions and increasing user friendliness, because it seems to me that there is still plenty of work left around the world when it comes to implementing good old core API legacy system, and probably at least half of the countries that should have it still don't have it. And then you have API and PNR and the rest of it. And in you implementing and using passenger data applications, in practice there are no shortcuts. If you don't have too much experience, it is good to start with normal API instead of jumping into more advanced applications. So I think the broad strategic objective would be to help countries to implement legacy API, which is an obligatory ICAO standard, while in parallel working with other states to build their capacity to use more advanced passenger data techniques.
So it's conceivable that a state which comes to you, IOM, for technical assistance to implement interactive API could be told by IOM that actually you should only focus on API for now and delay interactive API for a later stage?
Normally, when it comes to workshops or training or technical consultations, we would try to be inclusive and comprehensive and cover API, interactive API, and PNR, so that government officials, there would be a pool of people who understand the foundations, what are the differences, what are the similarities. In practical terms, very often, the biggest difficulty is not the lack of knowledge about API and PNR, but misconceptions. People very easily mix it up, and then it leads to implementation mistakes. So when it comes to workshops, to trainings, to consultations, we normally would try to cover all passenger data applications to make sure that people have a good broad understanding. Once the needs are clarified and the government says, in our situation, we need this, but not that, then we would focus on a specific passenger data application and would help them to make it happen.
Thank you. Any? Yes. Céline. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vijay. And you touch upon a very critical point and topic for air carriers, be it when there is an implementation of interactive API program, there is interaction. So airlines, air carriers are expecting a very quick response from the agency in charge, and with some kind of granularity in the response. So a go or no-go answer could be acceptable, but it's not really helpful for the carriers. Carriers need to understand what type, and we understand it's a fine line between having specific information, which carriers are not necessarily asking for, but to understand whether it's a question of visa. Let's take the example of a country where that requires electronic travel authorization. If the carriers need to know that if the no board answers that comes back is linked to the absence of these electronic travel authorizations, which would then trigger the agent at the airport to inform the passenger that maybe they still have time to request this authorization and they can still board the aircraft. Now, if it's for security reason, if this person is placed on a watch list, it's also useful for the airline to know that it's really no-go. So some kind of granularity in the response is needed to facilitate the passenger throughput and the experience of the passenger. And we are all travelers, and we understand that when we are at the checking process at the airport and there's an issue with our checking, it's never a comfortable situation for a passenger. So airline agents need to have an understanding of what are the options. Is it a real no-go, or are there options to still accommodate the passenger and make sure that he can get his flight? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think on this useful comment, I'd like to invite you actually to thank our distinguished panelists, Louvoyo and Eric, for their contributions. Please join me to thank them. And as they resume their seat, so that I can conclude, I would just like to offer a few brief remarks by way of conclusion to the two panels we had, which basically, in terms of inputs for states and ICAO to help states better implement API system, I think definitely a focus on the ICAO, IATA, WCO guidelines on API, and the need for states to take good note of the initial steps to implement an API system, bearing in mind this need for complementing, which was Louvoyo's point, complementing security needs and facilitation aspirations. That should also be underscoring an API system approach. It's actually to be able to deliver on both security, enhanced security, and enhanced facilitation. Establishing a National Air Transport Facilitation Committee, articulate the needs before you set out a tender process, set a strong legal basis, determine the precise costs and budget for the implementation and ongoing delivery of the API system, create a passenger data single window, and decide how the API data will be transmitted to the governments, and ensure there's a relevant stakeholders coming together to coordinate their approach to API and PNR system implementation. These and the other discussion points we've had hopefully will help you in a more effective and seamless implementation of API systems in your own home states. And I'd like to thank the ATB team, Narges, Garline, Christiane, Hubert, superb panelists for the two sessions, you, ladies and gentlemen, Denis, our wonderful maître de cérémonie, our interpreters, and the other members of the ICAO Secretariat for their help in putting all this together. By way of conclusion, I'd just like to leave you this final thought, that international civil aviation flows smoothly when all stakeholders work in harmony. We would all be better off if we can work intelligently together to harness the formidable strategic power of air transport to transform communities, cities, countries, and the world. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Shukran. Muchas gracias. Denis.
And on your behalf, I'd like to congratulate Vijay for an excellent job at moderating what was a first in the symposium and probably other ICAO events, this interactive session. And I would be the first to recommend Vijay as late night host on a television program near you. No, it was an excellent job, Vijay. Thank you very much. And this interactive session has also set the stage for the presentation by our sponsor for the reception in a few minutes. And I think